Hello, everyone. I'm Joan Devine, Director of Education for Pioneer Network, and so pleased to have you with us for the third webinar in our Sharing the Vision series. The webinars in this series are approximately 45 minutes long with some additional time for question and answer. Our goal is to present topics and start conversations that will inform and inspire as we work together to pioneer a new culture of aging. And in this series, we aim to bring more people into the discussion about ageism, how it impacts our lives and our work, and how both individually and together we can help put an end to ageism. Today's webinar will be in the form of a talk show style interview. You are welcome to add questions or comments in the chat box, and we will do our best to address them either during the interview or at the end. And so let's begin. I'm pleased to introduce our guest today, Ashton Applewhite. Pioneer Network is pleased to have Ashton as a friend and fellow pioneer on the journey. We were first introduced to Ashton several years ago when she was the keynote speaker at the 2017 annual conference. She again joined us last year, serving as a guide for an intensive session at the 2018 conference. Ashton, we're so pleased to now have you as part of our webinar series on ageism. So I want to welcome you, and in keeping in line with Pioneer Network values, can you begin by telling our listeners a little bit about yourself and the story behind your journey to becoming an anti-ageism activist?
A pleasure to be here and to be partnering with the Pioneer people whom I knew the first minute I was in the room with all of you that you were allies in the best sense of the word, ideologically committed to changing the culture of aging, as you say. I am a writer and sort of became an activist almost by accident. I started writing about age and aging 12 years ago in my mid-50s. And because I was afraid of getting old. Of course, I didn't realize that at the time, hindsight being 2020. But the aha moment for me was pretty early when I realized how much of what I thought I knew about being older was way off base or flat out wrong. I mean, just one example, I thought the odds of ending up in a nursing home were pretty good. And it turns out at that time, the percentage of Americans over 65 in nursing homes was 4.5%. It's down to 4% to 2.5%, just in this last decade. It's not that our fears and trepidations about aging are not real and not without justification. It's that they're so out of proportion to the reality that those fears serve interests that do not serve ours, and that the fear itself is bad for us. It divides us and it's bad for our health.
Well, there you go. So you kind of fell into this, it sounds like.
I fall into everything. I've never had a career plan. It became obvious very early on that ageism was central to this because the book I wrote is a manifesto, which is a call to social action because, you know, you can't, if we were talking, I should say ageism is any judgment about a person or a group of people on the basis of how old we think they are. It affects younger people too. We're such a youth-obsessed society that older people feel the brunt of it. A manifesto is a call for social action because we can't change, we're not going to change how society views aging without a grassroots social movement like the women's movement that starts between our ears, of course, and then reaches out to all of us on a mass level, the way the women think where we would be, the position of women in society without the women's movement. And imagine having a discussion about the place and power of women in the world that omitted sexism and omitted feminism. That's where we need to be around discussing the role of all ages, especially older people, and intergenerational equity in the world today, especially since most of us are living a lot longer than ever before, and that's not going to change.
That's true. Well, and Ashton, it makes me think of, you know, ageism as a movement. Our former executive director of Pioneer Network, Ruta Katamai, at one point Ketenoff, excuse me, I heard her make a comment about the thing about ageism is there are many, many movements, there's many, many isms that we can all sympathize with, we can all promote and support, but I will never be that person living in poverty, I hope. I will never be that person in a third world country whom I can advocate for, but when I'm advocating for ageism, I'm advocating for myself. Every one of us is, because the alternative is not such a good one.
Yes, although I think it is increasingly important to join forces and ally ourselves with people on the margins, or the movement against ageism will only benefit middle-class white people, right? Which is, you know, and it's really hard. I'm a middle-class white person. My audiences consist largely of people who look like me. And I've been reading a lot. It's Pride Month. There's so much here around and you know, the more radical spirits there are saying, gee, is the Pride movement taking into account the struggles of people of color, the struggles of trans people? The women's movement had a real terrible schism because it didn't address the issues faced by women of color. So I think the biggest challenge facing the movement against ageism, which is really getting off the ground in exciting ways that I'm happy to talk about, is how do we make sure that people with less privilege are part of the discussion? How do we listen to them? How do we make the struggle relevant and important for them?
As always, Ashton, you make us think beyond the box that we oftentimes think in. So let me ask you the next question I wanted to ask. You know, as we get into the whole conversation on ageism, one of the things that oftentimes comes up when people even bring the topic up is that they say, well, you're just being way too sensitive about this whole issue. Why are you so sensitive about ageism? What's the big deal?
Where's your sense of humor? Well, you know, lots of jokes about failing body parts are funny, but discrimination is never funny. So I would urge you to turn the tables on them a little bit, never in a snarky or gotcha kind of way, because that just puts people on the defensive, but to say, gee, would a similar comment or attitude on the basis of race or sex pass muster, right? Would you ever, because that's typically the context in which it occurs. You know, if someone calls you young lady, or you hear or see something ageist, you know, just why would you think that? Why would you say that? Are you still working? Why would you ask that? You know, are you still driving? How come? You know, why would you call me young lady? And put it back on them to think about why they made that assumption. Ageism is still so unexamined in our culture. Sometimes I say it's like washing a really dirty window. You know, there's a lot of work to be done, but on the other hand, you can really see where you've been. You know, when people who haven't even started to think about it go, oh, wait, that is when the gears start to change. And that moment, that aha moment, is very close to the surface in so many discussions around this. And that's really exciting and fun.
You know, I have to say, it was funny. I was on a plane the other night and I couldn't get the bag of pretzels open, which has been a problem for me. I've never had good hand strength. And it's interesting because the woman next to me offered to open it for me, and she did. And then she gave it back to me, and I can't even remember the exact words she used, but I can tell you her tone was condescending. It came up to me condescending, kind of like, well, here you are. You know, and I thought, you know, just because I have gray hair doesn't mean that my issue is I'm just not smart enough or I'm too old to open up this bag. It's just a stubborn bag and I couldn't open it.
Yeah, sometimes those bags are really, really hard to open. I think because we live in a culture that barrages us with messages that if you can't, you know, open the app or open the jar or open the damn bag of pretzels, you think it's your fault. The fact is the bag should be easier to open. And even if you weren't able to open it because of a legitimately age-related condition like arthritis or like the instructions were too small to see, there should be no shame in that, right? It is ageism in the culture that equates this decline as something shameful and that gives the discrimination a pass. It's not that hard to make bags that are openable, right? And there should be no shame in saying, I mean, I was on the subway trying to open a jar, a bottle, and there was a woman, a guy on one side of me, younger, and a younger man on the other side. And I thought, now do I be sexist, I asked the girl if she would help me. She couldn't open it either. I handed it to the guy, and we all three burst out laughing because, of course, this is like hipster Williamsburg, where everyone like wants to be politically correct. And we all laughed because and he did open it, but we all knew the calculus that was going on.
So it's life. It's
life.
Well,
it's life.
Let me kind of turn this around a little bit. So, Ashton, you did something, we all talk about, many of us talk about doing things, and you put it into action, and you wrote a book, This Chair Rocks, a manifesto against ageism. What prompted you to take this to that next step and do something about your passion?
That's a terrible question. I am a writer who I like the thinking. I do not like the writing. I had written one other serious book 20 years before, and I never wanted to write another book because it's evil. My advice to you writers out there is do not write a book unless you can't live without writing it. But enough people said you have to put this out in book form, and I have to say, the minute I did, everything changed. It's weird because I self-published it. The fancy publisher that had an option turned it down. They said, I kid you not, we're concerned that no one else is writing about this. I sold the book 3 years later to a new division of Macmillan who did not say that, which is another evidence of the fact that the culture is changing. Having a book is super handy because it's all your ideas in one place, and it does make you a more legitimate authority on the subject. So I'm really glad I did it.
Well, wonderful. So, and you've been on a book tour now throughout the United States, so you're probably still a little travel lag from that.
No, I'm recovered.
Oh, good. So how have people responded to your anti-ageism message? Are they naysayers, and what are they saying?
Well, I have to say it is a self-selecting audience. So it was very exciting from I'm a writer. I'm just me. I sit alone in a room all day cursing at my keyboard. So it was very, very exciting to realize, because I sort of put the word out, whoa, there really is a pro-aging network out there that wants to hear it. I don't think the naysayers were the people who showed up at my talks, but they were almost all standing room only. The most exciting thing from my point of view was that 10 years ago when I started out, and again, with no book, no credentials, just my little brain and my I knew I was onto something. I said to myself at one point, if you can't make hay with a project, make something out of a project that makes baby boomers feel better about getting older because of science and data, something's wrong with you. But it took a very long way, unhappy way, many years sort of floundering to find my way. And I, 10 years ago, was explaining to people what ageism is and why it's important. And now people were coming out from all over saying, how can we be anti-ageist in our work? Architects, social workers, librarians. A librarian saying, we have all this programming for young people. Why don't we have programming for older people? A big push from the Age-Friendly Cities Initiative, which is another huge anti-ageist program that I'm happy to talk about. People who are thinking, about how can we make our built environment friendly to all ages. So we have moved from theory to practice, right? From theory to tactics. And that is very exciting because I'm not a designer. I'm not a social worker. I'm not a librarian. I'm just me putting ideas out in the world. And it's really thrilling to see people bring their own expertise to how they can apply their own professional expertise and experience in their work lives and their personal lives.
Absolutely. It's interesting that you mentioned the anti-ageism cities, and we've been reading, we're very pleased that Louisville, which is the host city for our conference this year, is one of those cities. Have you had an opportunity to work with any people involved in municipalities that are working on that initiative? A little bit.
I've spoken to a lot of them and I get speaking opportunities from them. Each one is different, which is great. I think a really important thing about the Age-Friendly Cities initiative that a lot of people don't know is that it came from the World Health Organization. And I like to point out that's the World Health Organization, not the World Old People Organization, because of all this fascinating data, and it's just more and more all the time, that shows that attitudes towards aging affect how our minds and bodies function at the cellular level. It's not just about putting ramps around so that, you know, people in wheelchairs and on gurneys can get places. It's about a profound shift in our attitudes towards longer lives. The latest study out of Yale University shows that, and I don't even say people with a more positive attitude towards aging anymore. I say people with a more realistic attitude towards aging, right? This is not happy talk. I'm no Pollyanna about the challenges. People who have a deeper understanding of what aging actually involves for most of us, not only live longer, walk faster, are more likely to recover completely from severe disability. And that's from the Journal of the American Medical Association. And scientists do not make those kind of causal statements unless the data is really strong. But my favorite new study shows that people with more realistic attitudes towards aging are less likely to develop dementia, even if they have the gene that predisposes them to the disease.
Wow, that's incredible evidence. And you're right, attitude is such an important piece. I have to tell you, it reminds me back my days when I was a very young nurse. And I remember talking to a patient in the hospital who was an older woman. And somehow in the conversation, I threw out that quote, "Age is a matter of mind. If you don't mind, it don't matter." And she looked up at me and she said, "Oh, but honey, I do mind." And so there's our challenges as you go out there and you talk with people. How often do you see that as a response, people that really are, bought into all the things that we have learned about aging, and are they listening to you?
If people, everyone has to approach this in their own time, in their own way, at their own speed. I mean, I think I do not believe that age is just a number or that it's mind over matter, because age is a real number that indicates how old you are. And it is, so there's two sides to everything. Of course, it's the biggest topic in the world. There are things about aging that we all mind. I came this morning from the audiologist and I need a hearing aid. And I am delighted that there is technology that can help me, but I'm not thrilled about now needing another gizmo that will cost me money and that I'll have to, fumble for the batteries first thing in the morning. But, it's double-edged. On the other hand, I'm thrilled that I'll be able to hear better, right? So to say it's certainly not all attitude by any means, and I know you're not saying that, because I think that there is a tendency to put the burden on the individual. If you're not aging well, it's your fault for not doing enough Sudoku or exercising or, doing it right. There is no right or wrong way to age. If you wake up in the morning, you are doing it right. We are all hostage to all kinds of circumstances beyond our control. I got a brain tumor. Maybe it was from thinking unchristian thoughts, but I don't think so, right? And again, they could treat it. That's what ate my hearing. So I think it's really important in the flip side of the coin is to emphasize that luck plays a part too. Class plays a huge part. Can you afford leisure and good food and personal trainers and all those things, and not to think, oh, how well or badly I'm aging is because I'm doing it right or wrong. Everyone who wakes up in the morning is aging successfully. And back to your, the woman saying, honey, I do mind. I have women say all the time, look, I have Botox, I dye my hair. This is what I do in order to feel powerful and attractive in the world. More power to you. Whatever works for you, no judgment.
Yeah, I think the focus of person-centeredness, which is individualized approach, is so very much a part of this.
I'm so glad you brought up that language, because one of the best letters I've gotten in recent months was from a young 22-year-old British medical student. And I said, I'm coming to London. Let's have some beers. And we did. It was so great. It was he was so simpatico. He wrote me out of the blue. He was thinking of going into geriatrics, which in the UK, I think they call aged care. And he said and he was shocked at the degree of ignorance about aging and ageism in his medical education. And he said, how can we even talk in medicine about person-centered care without foregrounding the systematic bias in our attitudes and the system as a whole towards older people?
There you go. Wow, that's pretty powerful.
That was really powerful, right?
It was.
So one of the fun things is, you know, I'm learning this stuff all the time, and it's constantly recalibrating my way of thinking and my way of putting things, which is fantastic.
Yeah, and Mel said thumbs up for the medical student.
I know, he's so great.
So Ashton, you brought up the international piece here, going to Great Britain. What are you hearing on the international scene in terms of work that's being done?
Very exciting stuff. I am going to be spending most of November in Australia because Australia launched a national anti-ageism campaign. And I want to be, you know, I think that anti-ageism campaigns are inherently pro-aging, but it's different. There's a zillion things about aging healthfully and all of this stuff. This is different. These are political campaigns and social campaigns aimed at age discrimination itself, which is super exciting. And Australia's is called Every Age Counts. And they're bringing me to do a national tour in October to support that campaign. And also the Australian edition of my book will be out. There's a European edition organization called Age Platform Europe. And they did a super smart, sophisticated program that launched on the International Day of Older Persons last fall, which is in October, and terminated on the International Day of Human Rights. And every week, they targeted a different aspect of ageism and ableism, right? How we think about people with disability and how that overlaps, but of course is not the same as aging. I can talk more about that if you want. How ageism affects women's rights, how ageism affects health. Let me put a plug in for a website that I developed with two other colleagues that have also worked with Pioneer called Old School. And the website is oldschool.info, and it is a clearinghouse of free, vetted anti-ageism resources. Everything on it is free except the books. And since we launched it last August, we had to develop a campaigns section, a whole section, which has, I think, now 12 anti-ageism campaigns. Another one is the state of Colorado, which has used this report developed by the Frameworks Institute, which you can also find on Old School, for reframing especially our language around aging. It's a fantastic template for the other 49 states, right? And I like to point out that Colorado is not a red state or a blue state. You know, no matter what your politics are, you're getting older, and ageism is likely to cramp your prospects and affect your health unless you push back against it.
Absolutely. Well, well, so I don't forget, in your resources that are on the link that you all received, you will find the link to the Old School website so that you can go in there and explore and see all.
And please, if you know of things, send them in, submit them. And if you see something that needs creating, one of the things we're doing is developing a map to figure out, we learned this from the Australian campaign. They did a whole report on the drivers of ageism. What are the cultural forces that promote or benefit from ageism? And where are the inflection points where education might make a difference? Which reminds me of a study that just came out from Cornell. It's a meta study of all these different anti-ageism interventions. Guess what? They work, and they're cheap, and they're replicable, right? So now we have all these tools, right? So so if we now are learning where in the culture, what kinds of interventions are effective, if you don't see something and you have an idea, make it and send it in.
There you go. There you go. Well, I'm going to take a step back a minute and go back to your book again, Ashton. We know that your book was written in memory devoted to Dr. Robert Butler, who coined the term ageism in his book, Why Survive Being Old in America, which was published back in 1975.
Yeah.
And then also Maggie Kuhn, who founded the Great Panthers in 1970. So, you know, the good news is that people have been talking about it for that long. The bad news is people have been talking about it for that long. So why do you think we're not farther along in this? And what are maybe some of the things about Dr. Butler and Maggie Kuhn that inspired you?
I think we are further along. I think things have really changed in the last year and a half. And I am, again, I swear, no Pollyanna. I mean, when I first started learning about all this, I cannot tell you how skeptical I was. When I first encountered the U-curve of happiness, which shows that people are happiest at the beginnings of their lives and the end, I thought they must have cornered two 80-year-olds and given them a cookie. And then I thought, oh, that must be true if you're wealthy, or that must be true if you're healthy. The U curve is a function of the way aging itself affects the healthy brain. So I swear I am not cherry picking my data. The conversation is changing in the US and around the world. Ageism is percolating up all over, as are intergenerational initiatives, which I think are coming from different places in the culture. But the minute you mix the generations, you make it much harder to be ageist, and you build intergenerational friendships and alliances, which is an antidote to old versus young framing, which is never our friend. It's why I like to say all age-friendly cities or all age-friendly workplaces instead of age-friendly, because they're not just good for older people, they're good for everyone else. As to what has catalyzed it, my best theory, and it's only a theory, is that the baby boom, I am dead center, born in 1952. It finally dawned on our, my privileged and self-centered generation that, guess what? Yes, we may be aging differently than our parents did and very differently than our grandparents did, but guess what? We're still gonna get old. We might even be old, and let's come to terms with that, or at least attempt. And I mean, that too is double-edged. There's a lot of denial on the part of the boomers. Gee, because I'm hiking and my parents or grandparents at this age just sat on the porch swing or whatever, it's different. Well, it is and it isn't, right? It's double-edged as always. So I think that it's a function of demographic change. I also think the whole world is becoming aware of population aging, which means simply more older people as a proportion of the global population, mainly as a function of declining fertility rates. Not, more people are surviving to adulthood. That population aging is a permanent global demographic phenomenon, and we have to do a better job of both dealing with the challenges and taking advantage of the opportunities. I just wrote something last week that put this in context, that during the Paleolithic era, that was when 3 living generations became commonplace. They call it, there's a look up grandmother effect. That's when art happened. That's when music happened. That's when human civilization began to evolve. In this last century, we are starting to see 4 and even 5 living generations. It's another tectonic shift. It's happening at a time of deep anxiety around climate change, scarcity, AI, and in a world divided already, where people are exploiting deep divisions of race and class and gender, we cannot afford to add age to that list. And that is why, on the biggest imaginable scale, raising awareness of ageism and combating it is essential, honest to God, to the future of the species.
Wow, that's a lot to take in.
So I should have saved that for the end so we could all collapse. Sorry, but.
Well, I'm going to go over here and share a couple comments that have come through right now. We have Maria Leon from Lima, Peru, which is, and she said, we appreciate your work and we are your fans. Would you mind sharing the titles or links of the studies that you are mentioning, like the Yale study and the Cornell one? And Ashton, if you would like to send those to me, I can add those to the resource document that you will all get another copy of tomorrow when you get the recording.
I will do that, and I will also tell, with pleasure, and I would also tell you that I have a This Chair Rocks Facebook page, and I post all these things on there. I really tried to post only ageism-centric stuff. I mean, I do also say where I'm showing up, but both those things are there. And the Yale study came out almost over a year ago, actually, so I have a blog post about that. And if you are on Twitter, I also put tons of stuff up on Twitter.
Super, super. And your website is one of the things on the resource.
Yeah, so. thischairrocks.com/blog.
There you go. And here would Brent asked.
Oh, and it's searchable by topic, so you can enter dementia or enter Yale and find stuff yourself if I fail you.
Well, thank you for making it user friendly at any age. That's a good thing. And here's a question that kind of goes into the any age as you're talking about it. Brett asked a question: is it fair to say that ageism also applies to children in some ways?
Absolutely, absolutely. I just tweeted something. There was an article about the move to add an immigration question to the census. The people disproportionately affected by that change, if it goes through, are immigrants, obviously, and disproportionately children, which makes that legislation ageist. Children, too, deserve a voice, deserve respect. And children, again, ageism is any judgment on the basis of age. So anytime someone says children count less, or, you're so young, how could you possibly know how to do X, Y, Z? That's ageism too, and younger people experience a lot of it.
Yeah, I think it's kind of a universal. And I put out a little call. If people have questions, we're going to have plenty of time for your questions, and I'd certainly like to be able to contribute your questions to this conversation, because the comments so far have been wonderful. And there was one other comment I wanted to share with you, Ashton, in case you didn't see it. Amy mentioned, I'm so glad you addressed intersectionality and ageism. So thank you.
Yeah, it's really, intersectionality is the idea that different forms of oppression compound and reinforce each other. And it came out of, the word was coined by a Black legal scholar named Kimberly Crenshaw, who came across a case of a woman who was suing her employer on the basis that she was being discriminated against on the basis of being Black and being a woman. And the courts didn't have any way of dealing with this. And the women's movement, the intersectionality became the basis for sort of a schism that, in my opinion, was regrettable and deeply understandable in the women's movement, that became largely about advancing the position of white women without taking the additional issues faced by women of color. An example in the ageism movement is, are we embracing people with disabilities? Disability is not synonymous with aging by any means, but as it is now, people with disabilities don't, I think, they're ageist. The activists in that sphere are fascinating and fantastic, but they are intersectional along gender, queerness, class, everything, but age is not on their radar. How do we put age on their radar and make common cause with them? And how do we learn from what the amazing activists who got the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, passed in the 70s did, which was to change having a disability from a personal misfortune to a social problem. The example being, the problem is not that I'm in a wheelchair. The problem is that there are stairs between me and where I want to go, right? So we're back to that pretzel bag. The problem is not that I can't open the pretzel bag because I have arthritis, let's say. The problem is that the pretzel bag is hard to open, right? And how do we come together, whether we can't open the bag, or too little or too old or too fat or too lazy or too big or too small or whatever, to make these, make these barriers, see that they're barriers that all kinds of people face, and join forces to tear them down.
Well, and I think as we look at the barriers, and Ashton, I would love your perspective on this. One of the things that we've talked about a lot is the challenges, even those of us who work in aging services, who have the passion to make a difference for those that live in our community settings, or that we serve in whatever setting they live in, that we are saddled with the same challenges and struggles. And again, this was an experience I had this last week. I was sitting in the back of the room when they were showing a wonderful video on older athletes. And it was inspiring. And there was one woman in the video who had, because of some challenges in her life, she had to stop doing some of the things she had been doing, but she took up tango dancing. And it was her new passion. And they showed a short clip of her doing a wonderful dance with a gentleman. And off to the side of me, I heard a woman say, "Oh, how cute." And I just thought, my goodness, was that ageist?
Yeah, deeply ageist, because it's condescending, and I mean, how come a young people embracing is hot and older people embracing is cute, or worst case, yucky, because there's sort of a taboo around older sexuality. What's with that? If you hear that, it takes courage to confront people, but is there a way to say, would you like people to call you cute if that were you? A really good rule of thumb: don't call people, older people, or any group, a word you wouldn't use to describe yourself.
Well, Ashton, in your TED Talk, you talk about the person who says to you, "You look great for your age."
Yeah.
Did you share that with
Well, that's my only snappy answer. So thanks for feeding me that line, because it's really hard to come up with a snappy answer. But if someone says you look great for your age, say with a straight face, you look great for your age too. And let that uncomfortable silence sit there, because it is uncomfortable. But they have to think about why something they meant as a compliment doesn't actually feel like a compliment. And of course it doesn't, because it draws attention to your age. And what's wrong with being the damn age we are, right? I mean, it's embarrassing to be called out as older until we quit being embarrassed about it. And it is really liberating. It takes years and years and years of work, and I still work at it. There is no after, there are those many days I wake up in the morning, or I have to go get a hearing test, where I wish that certain things that hadn't happened to my body hadn't happened to my body, but I'm not ashamed of them anymore. And that's really liberating. And that's a cool thing about these younger disability rights activists, is they are proud to have the bodies they have, and they make it part of their identities. It's absolutely not something to be ashamed about, not something to be hidden, but something that deeply informs their humanity and their voice and the way they are in the world. And that's where we need to be with age. It's the task of a lifetime, and it can only be embarked on with others, atom by atom, day by day, minute by minute.
There you go. Well, can you, Ashton, I mean, I'm sure a lot of the people that are listening today are very much have given a lot of thought to this topic, but there's others probably who they really are just exploring the topic, and where do they fit in, and what can they do? So what would you counsel someone in terms of, I'm new to thinking about this. Obviously it's a part of me, but I'm new to thinking about it in a conscious way. What can I do? How can I start to make a difference, both for myself and for others?
Well, I would say, first of all, pat yourself on the back for realizing that by even posing that question, you are ahead of the curve and willing to look at something that is scary for most of us. So, that already puts you way ahead of the curve. I mean, I started writing about this, as I said, because I was afraid of getting older. I mean, I'm kind of a bull by the horns kind of person, but not everyone is. The very most important thing you can do is to look at your own attitudes towards age and aging. How do you use the words young and old? Do you use young to mean insert positive thing? I don't feel old. Well, do you really mean I don't feel invisible, or I don't feel useless? Use the word, not the substitute, because I don't know about you, but I felt ugly and invisible and incompetent at 13 way more than I do at 66. So those things are not a function of age. I will also put on the list, I have wrote a blog post of, 10 things you can do to help end ageism. Honestly, my book is a really good book. It's fun to read. If you don't want to spend the $20 or have the hours to devote to it, I totally get that. Listen to my TED Talk, which is a free download. If you are feeling a little more ambitious, start a consciousness raising group. On my website, again, thischairrocks.com/resources, and also available on Old School, is a guide to starting a consciousness raising group around age bias called Who Me? Ageist, because that's the uncomfortable first step, is like, oh crap, I'm ageist, and I am colluding in this. We all are. Everyone is ageist all the time. It's never a slate that you wipe clean. The good part, and the wonderful part, is that once you start to see it in yourself, you start to see it in the culture at large. And that is really liberating. That's what consciousness raising does. It's the tool that catalyzed the women's movement, because women came together and shared stories and realized that what they had been thinking of as personal problems, like getting harassed, not getting hired, not being respected, weren't personal problems. They weren't their fault for not being pretty enough or smart enough or whatever enough. They were social and political problems that required collective action. And that is the linchpin of movement building. That process of going from, this sucks, but we're stuck with it, to, oh, I actually am starting to see this differently to myself, for myself, to, oh, wait, it's a shared problem, to, oh, wait, we can come together and do something about it. It's called cognitive liberation. And it is the linchpin of movement building. Even if you just take the smallest step to, call, if someone, you see someone, with this horrible birthday cards, and say, why do you think that's funny? Or why, would you, if the card mocked someone on the basis of what color they were, or, what gender, what sexual orientation they were, would it be acceptable? What makes it okay about age? Try and provoke those conversations, and that's how we shift the culture.
There you go. Well, thank you. And we do have some questions here. So we have some Zoom users who are obviously very savvy, and they went into the Q&A, and here they are. Joe asked the question, do you think when we segregate all ages, housing, senior centers, etc., it creates false perceptions of each population?
Again, to each their own. It's double-edged. I don't think any kind of segregation is a good idea, because silos are never a good idea, because when we live with all ages, it's much harder to be ageist, and that's how we break down stereotypes, especially the patently ridiculous one that all old people are alike, because at the longer we live, the more different from one another we become. There are people who want to age with people their own age, who share their cultural references. More power to them. It's always double-edged. There are way more people who want to age in place, but all too often that is a recipe for age denial, which is never a good idea. So I don't recommend aging in place unless it means aging in community. So I think that's the big question is, can you figure out a way to get older where there are people around you, ideally of all ages, because, I want someone to, carry my groceries up the steps, and that's probably not going to be a fellow 80-year-old. It's probably going to be a younger person. I don't particularly gravitate to children, but I want to be, woken up now and then by music that I don't know, so that I can be reminded of the larger culture in which I live. That's just me. Maybe you want to be somewhere where you won't be, hostage to those kind of interruptions. We have to make our own solutions as best we can. But in general, I think that societies that are integrated in every way, which is what you see in rural life, in village life, it's never ageist, because the role of every person at every age is just, it's visible, it's evident. We don't have to think about it or critique it, we live it.
There you go. Well, Ashton, I have to tell you that was Joe Corella, who has a wonderful community. And Joe, I apologize if I'm saying the name wrong, Scandinavian Village. And Joe's actually going to be talking at the conference. I would love an opportunity for the two of you to meet each other sometime. So
one of these days.
Figure that out. We have another comment from Donna. She said, I live in Florida. I live in Colorado in an age-friendly city community and own a private aging life care management practice. While working with older adults, I consciously avoid stereotyping my clients in regard to age, regardless of relatedness of their health or personal care challenges.
Good for you. I mean, one of the thought experiments in the book is, imagine if you went to the doctor and your chart didn't have your age on it. Now, obviously, your age is part of your medical profile. It should be in there. But what if it weren't on the top page, right? What if it weren't there on your dating profile? What if people had to judge you for what they see and what they hear from you without having that name to pigeonhole you by? It's always double-edged. One of the toughest questions is, what do you say when someone asks how old you are? I'm a big fan of saying how old you are, because if we don't, people think that we're trying to hide it or we're ashamed of it. But I'm also a fan of saying, why do you want to know? Or tell me, I'm happy to tell you, but tell me what changed in your mind once you had a number. Or why do you think the number is important? And just continue to interrogate how we use age as a placeholder. And remember, we used to put race in newspaper stories, and we don't do it anymore because it allows people to pigeonhole us. So that would be an argument for omitting race from newspaper stories, unless you're a prodigy or, one of those 9 million-year-old tango dancers, right? It's always double-edged. There are two sides to it.
Wonderful answer. Thank you so much. And we do have I'll step back a minute to Joe, who said he did comment back, wonderful answer too on that question. And he said he will meet you and he looks forward to it.
Fantastic, me too.
Knowing Joe, he will find an opportunity. And then we had a remark from Haiti. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. She said, I agree with intersectionality and the analysis of ageism. Thanks. There's a big more discrimination in old women, Haiti, and she's from Lima, Peru again.
Yeah, I mean, we women are going to lead this movement. We already are. We need to learn to collaborate across the generations. The way it is now, you know, a lot of women compete, and we compete on terms that we did not create, that are dictated by capitalism and patriarchy, that judge our worth in terms that are not our friend, to say the least. We spend money on stuff, you know, we act, it's a scarcity mode. And we are not going to change things until we come together in groups of all ages, stop rating each other by how we look, remember older women, how hard it is to be young and be more generous, and ask younger women to be more generous to us as well. And you know, let's have solidarity.
There you go. Way to go, Ashton. I'm all for the solidarity. So we're at 1:45, and I'm sitting to see if anybody, I apologize, Brent just said I'm hard to hear compared to Ashton, and I apologize, I'm not quite sure, one of my technology issues, so I do apologize for that, but I'm glad to hear that Ashton is easy to hear because she has much wiser words to say.
Not so, but I have a voice, of course, I've always hated it, but it turns out to be easy to hear.
There we go. Well, I think if we have no more questions, I'm going to go ahead and we'll close out the webinar. And I just want to share just a few things with you. First off, I want to thank you, Ashton, for a lively conversation, which we knew it would be. You shared some great information. You have inspired and you have challenged us to be a part of this movement. And to our attendees, I want to thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy schedules to join today's conversation. We would love to hear your feedback on the webinar, and a link to the short survey was included in the email you received prior, and it will also be included in the email that you'll get in approximately 24 hours. That link will also include the webinar recording and the handout resource that we referenced. The webinar recording and handouts will also be available on Pioneer Network website under the Ageism tab in the resource library. So please feel free to go there and find it, or send other people. That there's a step in getting other people engaged in this movement, would be to send them to the website and have them look a little bit more. And you know, we really hope you enjoyed the webinar, that you'll join us for the next webinar in the Sharing the Vision series, which is the final one in this series, and it's on a cruel irony: ageism and ableism in senior living environments, with guide Jill Vitale Awesome. So it's really going to be a deep look at our own work that we do, and how the intersection between ageism and our work as well. And then I do also, of course, want to ask you, invite you to share with us in our other series, which is Growing Person-Centeredness. And in July, we're going to have a webinar featuring Cynthia Baker, and the topic is Applying Person-Centeredness to Trauma-Informed Care, a person-centered approach to the new CMS Trauma-Informed Care Regulation. So something we do always have to be cognizant of, and looking for answers and finding great ways to move forward in a person-centered way. So we hope that many of you will be joining us for the annual Pioneering a New Culture of Aging Conference, which is being held in Louisville, Kentucky next month, actually in August. It's going to be a great venue and an exciting program. And though Ashton won't be joining us this year because of a family obligation, her influence will certainly be felt in the many sessions that will touch on how ageism influences the work we do, and in the intensive, which will certainly continue the conversation we have engaged in today, Ageism, exploring the connection to who we are and the work we do. And so please check, whoops, we went the wrong way there. So please check out the website. Thank you, Ashton, and we look forward to continuing to follow the great work you are doing. And thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you.